Good morning, everybody. I saw a picture of sunrise yoga this morning at 6 a.m. That was very impressive. I was not in that picture. I'm so excited to be here with Hemant to talk about his book, and I have read it. I just got it autographed backstage. Hi,
Hi,
thanks for being here.
it's good to be here.
So, what I really enjoyed about your book was it was another way of making sense of the, massive 100-year kind of disruption that we're facing, and this notion that where in the previous age of disruption it fed scale, that we're now in a form of disruption that is having the opposite effect. Hopefully I summarized that well. And so I would love for you to put this in historical context. I think the last time we saw this kind of disruption, and you talk about this in the book, is when electricity was invented. So talk us through that, and then show us how this is different.
Yeah, so let's visually put an internal combustion engine here right in front of us, because I'll come back to it later. So electricity and electrification was, in some ways, the AI of the last 100 years. And if you think about the last century, scale was the measure of progress, right? We scaled power plants to make sure there was affordable electricity everywhere. We scaled healthcare to make it affordable, not quite affordable, didn't really work out in the end, but that was the premise, right? We scaled the corporations to create a middle class. All of it actually served us very well for about 100 years. But if you think about the turn of the century, every one of those systems ran into a wall. Power gave us climate change. You guys are all in finance. You know, what happened in 2008, I don't need to go into in terms of banks. Healthcare is practically bankrupting us. It's 20% of the GDP now and rising. So every one of these institutions was starting to break. And meanwhile, what started happening, and I wrote this book because of just some empirical observations in our own business in venture capital, entrepreneurs started to use AI and data, even before you called it AI, starting in 2007, to unravel a lot of these scaled systems. And they were starting to succeed. And we found ourselves investing, rather than in software companies for physicians or accountants or you name it, the workforce for consumers, we were literally funding companies that were building the modern banks, the modern healthcare services companies, the modern schools. And I was trying to understand what's really happening, that these are actually scaling successfully and taking share from these old systems. That's what led to the genesis of the book. And I think we're in a 30-year transformation of this economy that started in 2007 for a variety of reasons, starting with the creation of the iPhone, Amazon Web Services sort of as a platform, Facebook as a way to reach everybody, right? So we effectively started organizing content, community, commerce online, and you use data, you start thinking about products fundamentally differently. That's the premise around the book.
Say more about why AI leads to unscaling. How does that happen?
Yeah. Let me do that by giving you an example. Take the 32 or 35 million diabetes consumers that we have in this country. Here's what they have to do. First of all, they're all called type 2 diabetics. As a matter of protocol, you'll probably go see your PCP 4 times a year. And in between those visits, you're checking your blood glucose every day, a couple times a week, 5 times a day, depending upon how severe the condition is for you. You bring that data to the PCP and you guys discuss it and see what's going on. The reality is, those 4 times, if you're good enough to go see your PCP, you're probably okay that day. All the episodes happen in between those 4 visits. Whether you are hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic, you end up going to emergency rooms, there's seizures, and these episodes then lead to development of comorbidities. So we have this system where we tell all 32 million people, here's how we're going to manage your disease that we categorize as type 2 diabetes. Meanwhile, we've been involved in building a company over the last 6 years called Livongo, where we said, why don't we go give a connected glucometer to everybody that has type 2 diabetes. We'll monitor them. And if their blood glucose is trending in the wrong direction, based on patterns and using AI, we'll decipher for that specific person, are these trends problematic or not, and then intervene either with messages or with an actual call from a diabetes coach, and make sure you never regress to a point where you're going to have a seizure or you have to go to the ER room or your organs are failing. So that is the scaled mindset versus the unscaled mindset, which is really understand each person and deliver what's best for them. In that case, is personalized medicine. You can extrapolate that to personalized finance here, which is also happening. And in doing that, what we've noticed now that we have billions of data points around hundreds of thousands of people that manage this condition this way, that there's actually no thing called type 2 diabetes. There's all these underlying patterns that we never quite understood before that machine learning and AI can actually help us address. So that's an example of what we really mean in this sort of next phase.
And you give the example of this company in the book that your son is actually a user of the company.
It's the founder's son, and that's how it happened. So the person we started this company with, his son has diabetes, and they've been struggling with this thing forever. And I brought him to Silicon Valley one day and said, look, here's all this we've learned in how to service consumers and use data fundamentally differently. Why don't we apply it to health? No different from that same DNA being applied to financial services today. It's all concurrently happening, going back to my earlier point. We think we can serve these 32 million people fundamentally differently and transform their lives. They won't have to think about their disease. We will manage it for them.
Well, and of course, I love this example because it's consistent with the talk I gave yesterday about the importance of technology and touch, and this is a great example of that. There is a need for a human to call when there is a problem, but it's about knowing when there is a problem and not needing as many people because they're not on 24/7.
Yeah, this is a really important point because especially sitting in Silicon Valley, we've had this mindset of let's be hackers, let's iterate through products, the move fast and break things mindset. And the reality is when you start touching somebody's physical health or financial health, empathy really matters. I mean, it's people's lives on the other side, and bringing that consideration in how you design products and services is really important.
Yeah. So in the book, you have a series of chapters that talk about how this unscaling is going to play out in other sectors. So you've talked a little bit about healthcare. Talk about give some other examples of how this might play out before we talk about financial services.
Sure. How many of you have kids? So you'll relate to this. In our kids' schools, it's 9 o'clock, you're 14 years old, and therefore thou shalt learn math. Right? That's our education system. For these kids that are inherently curious, we dull them into these programmatic ways of learning and force them when they're not inspired to do those things. So education is an example where Khan Academy has done this, which is, hey, you should be learning at your own pace in the ways that you want to learn it. And so project-based learning, self-directed learning is happening in education. In finance, we can go into, obviously, there's lots of examples that are native to this audience. If you look at media, I mean, that's the premise behind Netflix, right? I mean, you go from the era of these blockbuster movies to you create content really effectively, and you understand exactly who your audience is that content will be enjoyed by, and that's who you market it to. So I think it's literally happening across the board today in all major parts of the economy.
So you have a chapter in the book about what AI and scaling are going to mean for finance, and I didn't know this before I started reading it, but of course the chapter starts with your work with Digit, and we're both investors in Digit. So use Digit as an example. I think many in this audience know Digit, but I'd love you to pull the thread through of how the theme you've just been talking about in other sectors, how that's actually the same thing.
Yeah, so I mean, Digit is to financial health what Livongo's example was to diabetes, right? There's a large percentage of our population that is not great at managing their financial resources, and frankly doesn't have enough financial resources to be comfortable. And so the act of decisioning on which bills to pay and how much to pay on your credit cards, or how to save enough for rent versus sort of the short-term decision of, can I afford to buy this one thing? It's all too complex when you have so many constraints coming at you and there's not enough resources. So Digit's core insight was, like most companies that end up becoming great, it was a feature. Features become companies, companies become, features become products, products become companies, companies become platforms. And that's ultimately, as venture capitalists, we're always looking for which features are going to become platforms. And so the core insight there was, savings is a delightful thing to happen to you. The act of saving is horrendous, right? And that's a great place to use data, understand a lot about your financial health, and essentially save for you. And that's how Digit started. And well, if I can save for you and we can earn your trust that we're doing that the right way, then we can also pay your bills. And we can also help you save for certain goals in other pockets that you're creating, or we can help you pay for college loans, or we can help you refinance your debt. So I think it becomes, the vision there would be that over time, they really can manage your financial health. And there are many companies that have started at different points of your sort of financial engagement as a consumer. They all look like features today, but they're all going to, over time, start to think about serving their customers in a deeper way with software. And you'll see a convergence of these companies.
So this is something you and I have now discussed and debated a little bit. Every financial institution, secretly or not so secretly, will tell you how much they hate regulation. But particularly for the biggest banks and providers among us, I like to say that regulation is the only thing that has kept disruption at bay. It's a significant barrier to entry in this particular industry. And so the question is, given that environment, and given the fact that we are talking about people's money here, do you think that regulation is going to end up being a governor of sorts on the kind of intense disruption that we're seeing in other arenas?
Yeah. So first of all, my personal philosophy is regulation is not bad. Bad regulation is bad.
Yes.
Right? I mean, I think it's just what gets written in the end matters as to the spirit of it. So whether you self-regulate in data and AI as a company, or you have regulations to make sure different constituents and ecosystems are created and treated fairly, I think that's actually essential. The problem with regulation, and the reason it atrophies innovation, is because over time, companies start thinking that the regulator is the customer. So the two ends of the spectrum that you have is you get these, two technology kids that say we can do anything, and we're going to start writing a software for helping you save and break rules all over the place. And if they become big, then the regulators start caring. But they're obsessed with consumer experiences, and that's why they start winning. Then you've got the major banks where the entire focus is on regulation. And yeah, they do consumer research studies and whatever else, but they're constrained, and it becomes part of the culture that's how you think about your business, and you forget about the consumer. Just to give you actually just a side story. Please. From healthcare, about a year and a half ago, I hosted about a dozen CEOs of large health systems for a conversation around this very issue, on how to change consumer experiences in healthcare. And it was at one of their elite conferences for the industry. And I sat with them for 4 hours, and I just listened to them go at it. Here's the problems, here's the problems. And I provided dinner because I just wanted to learn how all of them think. They asked me at the end of it, what do you think? It's like 4 hours, and you didn't mention the customer even once. And that's emblematic of what happens in every industry with regulation. So I think going back to understanding that whether you are this startup that needs to be conscious of regulation, or you're a bank that needs to rethink how to put the consumer in the middle, that's the only way you're going to change experiences. The regulations by themselves aren't what's, to me, necessarily getting in the way.
That's a good point. So I want to spend the rest of our time really talking about the last third of the book, which is about the idea that this dramatic disruption led by AI can do some amazing things, and it can do some things that are problematic, when it's just true of all technology, right? It's not good or bad, it's just a thing. And so I want to talk through these because I think these are really important and frankly what, as a society and as companies and as entrepreneurs and innovators, we're going to be grappling with for the next 10, 20 years. And they are in the categories of everything about data, right? Accessibility, privacy, ownership, control. Our next panel is going to be about that. Algorithmic accountability or algorithmic bias. We hear a lot about that. Monopoly platforms. And if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about future of work. So let's talk about data. This one is less of a how can things go wrong and more about what kind of data policies, systems, understandings do you think we need to make sort of the AI revolution really live up to its full potential?
Yeah. So remember that internal combustion engine I talked about? If I told you 120 years ago when we were looking at the first one of those, that this is going to transform our life with electricity, we all know how that happened, but it'll create climate change, how would we have thought about using that differently? I think we're sort of at that same moment with AI, only a few years into this becoming productive, and we're already seeing the difference between the two examples is, well, it took a while for the emissions to get to a point where you start feeling the effects. With AI, there's such fast feedback loops that you start feeling the effects now, what happened with the elections and everything going on with Facebook and so on. So we're feeling it earlier, but it's still just the beginning, and we need to get our arms around this. So the first thing is, I do think we need to be intentional about our approach to data. And in the context of data and privacy, there's the Eastern school of thought in China, which is capture everything, and they've got nefarious use cases, at least in my opinion, as to why they're doing that. Then there's a European sort of Western perspective on GDPR, which, I mean, and California is adopting some of that now as well. And
say a sentence for folks in the audience about GDPR.
So I was going to say, so the intent behind GDPR is you should know the use for data that you're capturing it for, and therefore you won't be capturing other sources of data that could be then used and abused, and the intentionality matters. Problem with that approach is the way AI works is you want to give it everything you can give it, so it detects patterns you weren't anticipating. So intentionality in the beginning, prior to data collection, actually inhibits the ability to develop the most globally competitive AI. So that regulation, while it might sound great in the short term, actually makes you long-term uncompetitive with the businesses that'll come out of China. Okay, so and that's something that's top of mind for us a lot. So you do have to be careful about what and how you regulate what data you're collecting. To me, the mindset should be we should be collecting everything, but then there needs to be rigor around algorithmic accountability, transparency, and explainability. We need to be able to measure what's this data being used for, just like we measure if a company is having corrupt or monopolistic business practices with the antitrust departments inside of the FTC. So I think that's my philosophy very much is capture everything and then use algorithms to measure algorithms and make sure it's being used properly, as opposed to fundamentally disadvantage ourselves in how AI gets developed.
All right, let's turn now to algorithmic bias. You can't go a day right now without seeing an article about how that bias, real or potential, is playing out in everything from how we choose whether to give someone bail or the length of their sentence in prison should be, to whether we should send in the Department of Child and Family Services because we think that this family is likely to be committing abuse, to all kinds of things. Say a little bit more about where you're most concerned and share with us what you think we need to be doing about it. I don't think there's a real silver bullet, simple answer here.
Yeah, so AI works because there's bias. It understands what the differences are and what's going to work for one person versus the other, whether it's in the echo chamber of news, where it's been used nefariously, or whether it's in understanding your diabetes. So that's just the premise of how the technology fundamentally works. The the to me, the best practice is, and this is what we tell our entrepreneurs when we build companies with them, is from the beginning, think about the minimum virtuous products that you're building. So don't take advantage of biases for the short-term interests of growth or your products. Think about how bias will serve in the long-term interests of society, and be building products with that mindset. Build in what I call algorithmic canaries, to look for where these biases are deviating from the interests in society and for consumers and for businesses, and for level playing field and everything else, and address those. So the issue is there hasn't been measurement of these side effects. All folks use with AI is how do we grow faster? How do we, perhaps get the consumers more hooked in what we're serving them, not necessarily about what's best for them. So to me, it's a product design place, and that's a pretty substantial conversation between us and a lot of our entrepreneurs where that matters.
It also does, though, seems like one of the challenges is that machines are just doing what we train them to do. And the data itself that we're using to train machines often already has bias in it in terms of who's included and who's not. And the engineers and entrepreneurs who are leading the training are, more often than not, white men. And as we know, this country is much more diverse than that. So how do we deal with that issue? It may not even be intentional, right? But it just may be simply exposure, or if we already have systems that lack diversity and inclusion, how do we ensure that we're not just reprogramming the current state? Because you can't learn from a future state that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, I think transparency of the data matters. That was the second point. The framework for AI for me is accountability, transparency, and explainability. I think showing what are the inputs into your system and how you get there is really important. And then explaining it so consumers and businesses can make their decisions and understand why the recommendations that are being made to them are for what purpose. To me, I think it's the entire framework has to be adopted in how we use data-driven products.
And I think in the book, you write about an effort that's underway. There are many efforts underway, but that I think that you're part of. That's a group of folks who have come together to sort of work on some standards or issues around this. Am I remembering correctly?
There's a bunch of efforts going on, and large technology companies are trying to get their act together around this. There's a bunch of AI groups. We actually have been teaching a class at Stanford, because I'm in the Bay Area, around this topic as well. I think we're getting our arms around this, but it is a complex topic. When you're, in my view, a lot of it is about the modern companies getting built and how they deal with these issues, because if we can get them on track, then we'll generally be okay. And for them, they're so focused on the short-term viability of their businesses, constantly getting them to think about these decisions, these long-term decisions from the beginning, and invest more in this, even though it's not relevant today for your next signpost. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road and how to make this in practice. So that conversation is happening. I think people have hopefully learned. You walk into Facebook today, they were not evil kids when they started the company. They are pretty demoralized on what's happening, but you're on this, shareholder stock price treadmill, and you got to produce revenues, and in the meantime, you have to figure out how to disrupt and think about what's good for the long term. It just becomes really challenging later on. And so just catching these things early is essential.
Right. Well, I really like how you frame that around short-term versus long-term thinking, which, as we know, is just a mental challenge for all of us.
Yeah.
And we often talk about short-termism in the public markets, but it's interesting to think about it in the context of startups, right?
Human beings are short-term thinkers.
Yeah.
That's just the way we're wired.
Let's turn to monopoly platforms. If I understand it correctly, the idea is now if you want to start a business, because you don't really need scale anymore, you don't have to build your own data warehouse. You don't have to build the internet. Those things are all things you can plug into. But as a result, there are going to be a handful of, I'll use the U word, utilities, right? whether it's Amazon Web Services for cloud computing or any of the other platforms we're going to use, Amazon to sell your stuff. But monopolies aren't necessarily always a good thing. So suss out that issue a little bit, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, so if you think about how the oil companies and the communications companies were dealt with in the context of monopoly, it was actually pretty easy because you could constrain their influence geographically. Utilities, they all got regulated to focus on geographies. The problem in today's businesses that are internet-enabled is that they operate fundamentally because there's network effects. So ubiquity of access is what makes these businesses work. So rather than thinking about them as geographic share, I tend to think about these businesses as sort of networks of consumers and businesses, AI, and then the data. And so I think the question is, well, how do you regulate these kinds of businesses? There are two challenges in the old metaphor, the Sherman antitrust frameworks that have existed for so long. One is, well, most of these services are free for consumers, so there is no price abuse by these companies. And second is, as I said, this whole idea of sort of how do you break these up. Our view has been, well, it's not about consumers, it's about the existence of innovation and allowing ecosystems to thrive on top of these platforms, making sure these companies do that. So when you build on top of Instagram and use them for marketing spend, most businesses that build on top of Instagram, all their margin goes to Instagram. They're not very profitable. They can't really, they sustain, but they can't thrive. Instagram will give you just enough of the revenue share from a cost perspective that you stay in business, but it feeds the beast, right? And that's not a platform. That's a company that's abusing the ecosystem around it, in my opinion. And so how do you think about allowing innovation to actually thrive? Because if you don't have innovation, then you lead into these issues of the last generation issues like climate change that I talked about. That's why it happens. Utilities stopped innovating. They got stuck on coal and never experimented with new resources, and we got to where we were. Same will happen in its own way with AI, with these large platforms. So allowing innovation to thrive is the core thing that I focus on in terms of these platforms. And what needs to happen? Well, they got to either, two of those three layers, data, AI, and consumer and business access, the network, they got to open up two of those for others to build on top of. One's not enough, and three would be not fair. But I think they have to open enough so these businesses can build.
I wish we could spend more time talking about this. We're out of time. Let me close with one quick question for you. You see tons of innovators, tons of deals. When you think longer term, what are you most excited about? 30 seconds.
If you could probably tell, I'm pretty interested in fintech and healthcare right now. I think these are two major markets that are changing fundamentally. We have invested a lot in both of these areas, and this innovation is not stopping for another 10 years. So it's sort of interesting in your financial health network, those two words are actually representative of two major intertwined markets that both have to fundamentally evolve for our society.
And as we were talking about backstage, the fact is it's going to be the combination of those two things that we haven't even started to think about very much yet. So next time I'll bring you back, we'll talk about that. Help me thank Hemant and Neha.
Thank you.